They celebrated that night as if a missing piece of their bloodline had finally been restored. Champagne glasses clinked under crystal lights, smiles stretched wide, and a child stood at the center of it all, dressed in borrowed elegance, accepting affection that was never meant for her. Just a few steps away, barely noticed, another child watched quietly, her small hands clenched, her eyes fixed on a family that shared her blood but refused her truth. One was welcomed as a miracle returned. The other was dismissed as a liar reaching for a life she did not deserve. Two girls stood under the same roof, carrying the same history, yet only one name was spoken with pride. And in that moment, no one realized that the greatest mistake of this family had already been made. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What you are about to hear is a true-style account inspired by documented cases of child identity fraud, family deception, and inheritance disputes that have surfaced repeatedly across court records, investigative journalism, and orphanage scandals over the past decades. These stories often begin the same way, with grief, confusion, and misplaced trust, and they almost always end with regret that no apology can erase. This is one of those stories, told not through headlines, but through the quiet suffering of a child who knew the truth long before anyone was willing to listen. The family at the center of this story was known as the Smiths, a name that carried weight in their city. Generations of careful planning, business success, and social influence had built a legacy that few questioned and many admired. At the head of the family were Harold and Margaret Smith, a couple who believed deeply in order, reputation, and bloodline. They raised 4 children in a large estate that symbolized stability and control. 3 sons followed the expected path, entering the family business and marrying within their social circle. Their only daughter, Claire Smith, was different. She was warm, independent, and quietly resistant to the rigid expectations placed on her. When she fell in love with a man outside her family's world, she chose love over legacy, a decision that created distance but never erased her place in her parents' hearts. Claire later gave birth to a daughter she named Bonnie. She spoke of her often, sent photos, and promised that one day she would bring her home so her grandparents could finally meet her. That day never came. Claire died suddenly under circumstances that were ruled accidental, leaving Bonnie without her mother and without protection. Around the same time, another child entered the same orphanage, a girl named Eva, brought in by a woman who showed little interest in staying involved. What no one questioned at the time was how quickly records changed, how files were altered, and how easily one child's identity could be reassigned when money and desperation met opportunity. By the time the Smith family came searching for their granddaughter, the truth had already been rewritten on paper. When the Smith brothers arrived at the orphanage, they expected uncertainty, but not chaos. Eva stepped forward calmly, introduced herself with the name Bonnie Smith, and recited details she had been coached to remember. The staff confirmed her story with documents that appeared official. Then another child screamed. The real Bonnie cried uncontrollably, calling the men uncle, pointing at their faces with recognition fueled by years of stories and photographs her mother had shared. She begged them to believe her. The brothers stood frozen, torn between emotion and evidence. They had never seen their sister's child before. One girl had proof. The other had only tears. In that moment, logic won, and blood was ignored. And as the car drove away with the wrong child inside, the real granddaughter collapsed on the orphanage floor, watching her family disappear for the second time in her young life. The Smith family did not build their name on chance. It was built carefully, deliberately, across decades of discipline, influence, and quiet authority. Mr. Smith was known as a man whose word carried weight in boardrooms and private circles alike, while Mrs. Smith was regarded as the keeper of tradition, a woman who believed that family order was the highest form of protection. Together, they created a household where reputation mattered as much as blood, and where mistakes were corrected swiftly and privately. Their estate stood as a symbol of that philosophy, a place where rules were clear and emotions were often restrained. To the outside world, the Smiths represented success done properly. Inside the family, loyalty was expected, obedience was assumed, and love was often expressed through structure rather than warmth. They raised 4 children under that roof. 3 sons who followed the path laid out for them, and 1 daughter who quietly challenged it. Claire Smith was different from an early age. She was gentle where her brothers were firm, reflective where they were decisive, and compassionate in ways that did not always align with the family's rigid expectations. Claire loved deeply and openly, and when she chose a partner who did not come from wealth or influence, it was not rebellion, but conviction. Her marriage was never publicly opposed, yet it created a subtle distance that never fully healed. Claire moved away, choosing a simpler life, believing that peace mattered more than approval. Years later, Claire became a mother. She named her daughter Bonnie, and from the moment Bonnie was born, Claire spoke of her as her greatest purpose. She sent letters and photos to her parents, carefully curated glimpses of a child growing up loved but far removed from the Smith estate. Claire promised that one day she would bring Bonnie home, when the time was right, when life felt stable, when she could protect her child from judgment. That reunion remained an idea, never a reality. When Claire died suddenly, the Smith family mourned a daughter they had loved but never fully understood. Somewhere beyond their reach, their granddaughter Bonnie was left alone, carrying a truth that would soon be questioned, doubted, and nearly erased. At the time, the Smiths believed their greatest loss was behind them. They grieved, held memorials, and spoke of legacy, unaware that their next chapter was already unfolding in silence. They knew they had a granddaughter, but she remained a name attached to photographs and memories, not a face they could recognize. That absence would soon become the weakness that allowed a lie to settle in comfortably. As the family prepared to reclaim what they believed was theirs, they trusted systems, documents, and appearances, never considering how easily those things could be shaped. And while the Smith family waited to welcome their granddaughter home, Bonnie waited somewhere else entirely, holding on to the only inheritance her mother had left her, the truth. Long before the Smith family ever set foot in an orphanage, another life had already been orbiting the edges of Claire Smith's world. Her name was Linda, a woman whose life had unfolded very differently despite living just streets away. Linda struggled through unstable work, unpaid bills, and the quiet bitterness that grows when survival feels endless. She watched Claire from a distance, noticing the contrast between their lives, not because Claire lived extravagantly, but because she carried something Linda believed she would never have, a safety net. Claire had parents who could catch her if she fell, a family name that opened doors, and a daughter, Bonnie, who would one day inherit a sense of belonging Linda feared her own child would never know. That difference settled deeply inside her, growing into resentment she rarely voiced but constantly nurtured. Linda's fixation sharpened when she learned that Claire planned to return home to the Smith estate with Bonnie. It was meant to be temporary, a visit, an attempt to reconnect and allow her parents to finally meet their granddaughter. To Linda, it sounded like destiny rearranging itself unfairly. She saw that return as the moment Bonnie's future would be sealed, wrapped in comfort, security, and privilege. Linda began to believe that fate had chosen the wrong child. That belief did not arrive suddenly, but once it settled, it refused to leave. In her mind, the world had already taken too much from her, and she was owed something in return. The day Claire died was ruled an accident. A fall. A moment of misjudgment. A tragedy without witnesses. What no report captured was the presence of Linda nearby, the argument that preceded it, or the calculated push that ended Claire's life. There were no investigations that lingered, no suspicions raised loudly enough to matter. Grief moved quickly, and paperwork closed quietly. With Claire gone, Bonnie was left unprotected, and Linda saw her chance solidify. She disappeared shortly after, reappearing only long enough to place her own daughter, Eva, into the system alongside Bonnie. Two girls entered the orphanage carrying very different truths. One had lost her mother. The other had gained an opportunity. And in that shared space, where records mattered more than memory, the foundation for the greatest lie of the Smith family was set in motion. The orphanage was not a place where truth lived comfortably. It was overcrowded, underfunded, and dependent on paperwork that few ever questioned closely. Linda understood this well. She returned quietly, not as a grieving woman, but as someone with a plan and just enough money to make it work. The caretaker had seen bribes before, small favors exchanged for altered dates or missing signatures, and this one was no different. Files were adjusted carefully. Birth records were swapped. Names were reassigned. Photos that once belonged to Bonnie were removed and discarded. In their place, Eva's image appeared, labeled neatly as Claire Smith's daughter. Bonnie's file was thinned down to almost nothing, her identity reduced to an entry without family, without history, without anyone expected to come looking. Linda spent weeks preparing Eva for the role she would soon play. She taught her the name Claire Smith, rehearsed the story of a mother who had died, and repeated the importance of remembering every detail exactly as instructed. Eva was 8 years old, still forming her sense of self, still eager to please the one person she depended on. She did not understand the weight of what was being done in her name. She only knew that this new story promised safety, comfort, and a future her old life never could. Bonnie, meanwhile, spoke often of her mother, of her grandparents, of a home she believed was waiting for her. Each word she spoke made the lie more urgent. When the Smith brothers finally arrived, guided by records and official correspondence, they were handed a folder that appeared complete. It named Eva as Claire Smith's daughter. It carried the stamps, signatures, and dates they trusted. Bonnie tried desperately to correct the mistake, but truth without proof sounded like confusion. In that moment, identity was decided not by blood or memory, but by ink on paper. And that was all it took for Eva to be chosen and Bonnie to be forgotten. The day the Smith brothers walked into the orphanage marked the moment when truth and doubt stood face to face. The three men arrived with purpose, carrying the weight of responsibility and grief, determined to bring their sister's child home. They had prepared themselves for emotion, but not for chaos. As soon as their presence was announced, Eva stepped forward calmly, her posture steady, her voice rehearsed, introducing herself as Claire Smith's daughter without hesitation. She met their eyes the way Linda had taught her to, confidently, as though she had been waiting for them all along. To anyone watching, she looked like a child finally found. Then Bonnie screamed. The sound cut through the room, raw and desperate. She ran toward the men, calling them uncle, reaching for hands she recognized instantly. Her mother had shown her their photographs so many times that their faces were familiar, etched into her memory through stories of family and home. Bonnie cried uncontrollably, begging them to listen, insisting that Eva was lying, that she herself was Claire Smith's daughter. Her words tumbled out in panic, fueled by the terror of being erased in front of her own family. Eva stood silent, shaking her head, denying everything with practiced confusion. The caretaker intervened, opening the file, pointing to the documents that confirmed Eva's identity. Every official record supported her claim. The brothers stood frozen, torn between the child clinging to them in desperation and the paperwork that appeared undeniable. They wanted to believe Bonnie, but logic demanded order, and order demanded proof. Slowly, painfully, they chose the child whose story matched the records. As Eva was led away, Bonnie collapsed to the floor, her cries echoing long after the door closed behind the family that was supposed to be hers. Bonnie refused to accept the finality of what had just happened. Even as the Smith brothers prepared to leave with Eva, she clung to the edges of the moment, sobbing, pleading, repeating her mother's name as if saying it enough times might make someone believe her. One of the brothers hesitated. He watched Bonnie's collapse, the way her small body shook with grief that felt far too heavy for a child her age. There was something about her certainty, the way she spoke their names without prompting, that unsettled him. It did not feel like a performance. It felt like loss. That doubt followed them all the way to the door, refusing to be silenced. After a tense discussion among themselves, the brothers made a decision that felt merciful, even if it was not just. They would take Bonnie as well, not as family, but as charity. She would be given shelter, education, and food, but not a name that carried weight. It was framed as kindness, a compromise that allowed them to ease their conscience without challenging the records they trusted. Bonnie agreed instantly. To her, staying close was not about comfort. It was about survival. She believed that if she remained near them, the truth might one day find its way out. Eva watched the decision in silence. She did not protest. She did not celebrate. She understood something Bonnie did not yet fully grasp. Proximity was dangerous. Every shared space increased the risk that memory, habit, or resemblance could expose what paperwork had concealed. Eva learned quickly that survival would require more than silence. It would require control. And as the two girls left the orphanage together, one believing she had lost everything, the other believing she had gained it, the lie entered its most fragile phase. The Smith mansion opened its doors with ceremony and relief, as though a chapter long delayed had finally been corrected. Mr. and Mrs. Smith stood waiting, their posture formal but their eyes searching, eager to place a face to the granddaughter they had imagined for years. When Eva was presented to them as Claire Smith's child, Mrs. Smith's restraint dissolved instantly. She pulled Eva close, studying her features, convincing herself she saw her daughter reflected there. Every gesture that followed was soaked in relief and pride, as if welcoming Eva erased the regret of years spent apart from Claire. Bonnie stood nearby, introduced not by name or lineage, but as an orphan the family had rescued out of compassion. The distinction was immediate and unmistakable. Eva belonged. Bonnie occupied space. Mrs. Smith's gaze lingered on Bonnie with suspicion, interpreting her quietness as calculation and her grief as manipulation, quickly deciding that this child wanted more than she deserved. Eva adjusted with remarkable speed. She learned when to speak and when to cry, how to mirror Mrs. Smith's expectations, and how to position herself as fragile, grateful, and obedient. Linda remained close to the family, presenting herself as a loyal helper, someone who understood Eva's needs better than anyone else. Under that protection, Eva learned to redirect blame effortlessly. When things went missing, Bonnie was nearby. When rules were broken, Bonnie had been watching. Each accusation landed easily because it aligned with what Mrs. Smith already believed. Bonnie's protests were interpreted as ingratitude. Her attempts to explain were labeled lies. The power imbalance settled into routine, reinforced daily by affection given to one child and suspicion placed on the other. Within the mansion's walls, Eva learned that the truth mattered less than perception, and Bonnie learned that blood alone was not enough to be believed. Life inside the Smith mansion quickly settled into a rhythm that made the imbalance impossible to ignore. Eva was given the best room, the finest clothes, and constant reassurance that she was exactly where she belonged. Mrs. Smith watched her closely, guiding her manners, correcting her posture, and proudly introducing her to guests as Claire Smith's daughter, the rightful continuation of the family line. Every smile Eva offered was rewarded, every tear met with concern. Bonnie, on the other hand, was positioned on the margins of the household. She ate at different times, slept in a smaller room, and was constantly reminded, directly and indirectly, that she was there because of kindness, not connection. Mrs. Smith interpreted Bonnie's silence as attitude and her sadness as manipulation, often accusing her of being ungrateful for a life she had not asked for. With Linda's quiet influence nearby, Eva learned how to stay flawless in Mrs. Smith's eyes, how to cry at the right moments, how to shift attention, and how to frame Bonnie without ever appearing cruel. Each small lie added weight to the larger one, and with every passing day, the family grew more certain they had chosen correctly, never suspecting that certainty itself was their greatest error. As the years passed, the imbalance hardened into something Bonnie could no longer escape. She grew up under constant suspicion, blamed for conflicts she did not create and punished for mistakes she did not make. Every broken rule was assumed to be hers, every missing object traced back to her presence. Mrs. Smith became the loudest voice reinforcing this narrative, criticizing Bonnie's behavior, questioning her intentions, and reminding her repeatedly that gratitude should be her default state. To Mrs. Smith, Bonnie was a reminder of disorder, a child who disrupted the harmony she worked so hard to maintain. Eva, meanwhile, flourished. She was praised for her achievements, defended when challenged, and shielded from consequences that Bonnie faced without hesitation. Eva learned that protection was automatic and affection was guaranteed, and she leaned into that security with confidence. The Smith brothers watched this dynamic from a distance. They sensed something was wrong, but doubt made them hesitant. Revisiting the past meant reopening grief, questioning decisions they believed were logical, and admitting that a child's cries may have been dismissed too easily. Choosing peace felt safer than investigation. Bonnie endured quietly, growing older with a resilience shaped by isolation rather than care. Through it all, she held on to one thing she never spoke about. Hidden among her few belongings was a video recording her mother, Claire Smith, had given her shortly before her death. It was meant for the future, for a moment when Bonnie needed proof of who she was. Bonnie did not know when that moment would come, only that it was the last piece of her mother she had left, and the only truth no one else could erase. The day the truth finally surfaced began like any other family gathering at the Smith mansion, with laughter, clinking glasses, and conversations about business, social obligations, and the upcoming holidays. Eva sat at the center, confident, smiling, the picture of the long-lost granddaughter who had been adored for years. Bonnie, quiet as always, lingered at the edge, clutching the small box where she had kept her mother's recording all these years. No one suspected the small device she carried would soon shatter the carefully constructed illusion that had held the family in its grip for so long. When Bonnie quietly asked to play it, there were murmurs of impatience and doubt, but something in her voice compelled the Smiths to pause, to allow her the space she had long been denied. The room went silent as Claire Smith's face appeared on the screen. Her voice was calm but firm, addressing her parents directly, naming Bonnie as her daughter, and speaking with clarity about the love, care, and identity that had been denied. Every word cut through the years of deception, cutting deeper than any argument could. The Smith family froze. Mr. and Mrs. Smith stared, disbelief etched on their faces. The brothers exchanged glances that carried the weight of regret and shame. Eva's face went pale as the recording continued, and the lies she had relied upon for so long began to unravel in real time. Linda's presence could no longer shield her. Her schemes, the altered documents, the bribed caretaker, and every carefully planned manipulation were suddenly visible under the unyielding truth of Claire Smith's words. Documents were pulled from drawers, files reopened, and the orphanage records that had once seemed airtight were re-examined. Every altered page, every deleted photo, every manipulated signature was exposed as fraud. Eva's mother, once invisible behind her daughter's performance, could no longer hide. Her deception had been absolute, but even the most carefully constructed lies could not withstand a recording created by the woman at the center of the entire story, Claire Smith. The room was heavy with silence, punctuated only by gasps and the realization of betrayal. For the first time in years, Bonnie stood as herself, not an outsider, not a charity case, not a shadow, but the rightful granddaughter, the daughter of the family whose love and acknowledgement had been stolen. And in that moment, the Smith family finally understood the full extent of the injustice they had unwittingly perpetuated. The aftermath of the revelation left the Smith mansion in stunned silence. Mrs. Smith, who had once embraced Eva with so much pride and warmth, now faced the unbearable weight of having rejected her own blood. Every harsh word she had spoken to Bonnie, every glance of distrust, every assumption that had painted her real granddaughter as ungrateful, returned to her with relentless clarity. The guilt was immediate, heavy, and inescapable. Her hands trembled as she reached for Bonnie, finally seeing the child she had overlooked for years, the child who carried not just a name, but the unspoken grief of being denied the love that was rightfully hers. The brothers, too, could no longer avoid the truth. Every choice they had made, choosing documentation over intuition, silence over confrontation, convenience over justice, pressed upon them like a physical weight. They confronted the reality that their inaction had allowed deception to thrive for years, and their faces reflected the mix of anger at themselves and sorrow for the child they had ignored. Eva, stripped of her false identity, could no longer claim the family she had lived among. Her mother's manipulations had been exposed, and with nowhere left to hide, the illusion she had relied on collapsed entirely. Bonnie finally inherited what had always been hers, not only the family name but also the painful knowledge that love had been denied to her when she needed it most. She learned that belonging is fragile, that truth can be buried beneath appearances and manipulated evidence, and that even families with the deepest affection can make irreversible mistakes when assumptions replace understanding. In the quiet that followed, the Smith family reflected on how easily trust can be misplaced, how dangerous it is to judge without certainty, and how the passage of time cannot undo what was once lost. Bonnie's return restored what had been stolen, yet it carried with it a lesson that would never be forgotten, that love and recognition, when withheld, leave scars far deeper than any deception can conceal.